In this lesson, I'll share with you the process of combining alcohol-based markers with colored pencils to create a realistic drawing of some candy. Candy. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this lesson I'd like to share with you my process for combining alcohol-based markers with colored pencils to create realistic images. Now in this lesson I'll be working on marker paper by Canson. It's a semi-transparent paper, but it is also great for working with markers, and of course you can apply colored pencils to this surface as well. I'll be using Prismacolor alcohol-based markers to create an underpainting, and then over the top we'll apply colored pencils. I'll be using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils to finish the image. Now, if you're brand new to the channel, I would encourage you to subscribe. It's absolutely free to do so, and make sure that you click on that notification bell so that you receive updates when we upload new videos. We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter on this channel. We also have a fantastic membership program over at thevirtualinstructor.com. You can check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free. I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the drawing. We'll start here with a graphite sketch, and since accuracy is so important, I used a light board to transfer the contour line information over to the marker paper. But even with a transfer using a light board or a graphite transfer, it's still not as accurate as you would like it to be in most cases. So I decided to go back into the transfer and add the details and refine the drawing, as you can see here. Now, I used a 2H graphite pencil for this. This is actually a lead holder with 2H graphite inside of it. You want to make sure that you're not using a graphite grade that is so soft that the graphite is going to show through the marker applications and, of course, the colored pencil applications, which will follow. Now that the graphite drawing is in place, we're ready to reach for those markers and start adding some color. Now, as I mentioned before, I'll be using Prismacolor alcohol-based markers for this drawing. You're welcome to use any brand of alcohol-based markers that you wish. They're all going to have slightly different names for the colors, of course. So if you're not using the Prismacolor markers, you can just substitute with a color that's similar. The first color I'm adding here is dark brown, and you can see here that I'm just making an initial application here to the brown parts of the wrapper. Now I'll note here that with alcohol-based markers, the intensity of the color increases with the more layers that you apply. Now, of course, there is a limit to this. There's a point at which you cannot increase the intensity any further. But at this point, I'm trying to be careful that I'm only applying one layer of the marker to the surface. Of course, we'll start to adjust the values a little bit later in the process, but for now, we'll go ahead and just fill in all of the dark brown areas on the wrapper with this dark brown marker. Of course, there are 2 tips on this particular brand of marker, and I'm using the more finer tip. There is, of course, a chisel tip to cover larger areas, which I'll use sparingly in this demonstration since this drawing is so small. Now you'll notice I've switched over to another marker. This is dark umber, and this color is going to serve to create some of the shadowed areas on the brown parts of the wrapper. Now, what we're creating here is clearly an underpainting. Now, marker drawings can stand on their own as completed images, but in this case, we're using the markers as basically a base to apply colored pencil applications over the top. Now, we could do the entire drawing with colored pencils, but it would obviously take a longer period of time. So using these markers, of course, creates a nice base and saves us some time while adding to the complexity of the color. Now, after I've worked down the body of the wrapper, I've now switched over to another marker, and this is going to add a little bit of variety in the color. This color is sienna brown. Now, it's obviously a little bit more orange compared to the browns that we've used so far. And like I said, this is just going to add a bit of color. Now it's back to the dark umber, creating some of the darker values that we see on both the top and lower portion of the brown parts of the wrapper, and also back to the sienna brown as we're adding a little bit more variety to the color. Now, of course, we're going to stick with these same three colors for the bulk of the areas of dark brown on the wrapper. You can see here I'm going over the top of the dark brown areas with a bit of dark umber, and of course this is followed by a bit of sienna brown. All I'm doing here is simply paying attention to the shapes of darker value, the shapes of middle value, and the shapes of bits of color that we can add here with the sienna brown. We'll, of course, move down to the lower portion of the torn wrapper and repeat this process again with the dark brown, followed by the dark umber, and then a bit of color with the sienna brown. Now, there is a bit of the dark brown wrapper showing here where it kind of folds over on itself. So we're taking care to work around the white text on the label to add some of those bits of darker brown. Now we're ready to start addressing the letters on the label, and we're going to start here with a bit of ultramarine. Just like we did with the brown parts of the wrapper, we're going to add a little bit more variety to this particular color. There are some subtle shadows and subtle highlights that happen even within these letters. So you'll see here we'll first apply a bit of the ultramarine, and then we're going to go back over the top of it with a blue that is just slightly darker, and this is indigo blue. So you can see here I'm going back over the top of the initial applications with the ultramarine with a bit of the indigo blue to add just a little bit more variety there, to add a little bit of a hint of shadow here and there. And as the drawing develops, you'll start to better understand the subtle shadows and subtle highlights and how they contribute to creating the illusion of a realistic drawing. Now you'll also notice that as I'm filling in these letters, I'm leaving open those little white sections that are in the writing that I didn't draw out with the pencil, of course. So this is something that I'm adding during the process of adding color. And of course, this is a common thing when you're creating a color drawing. You're going to continue to alter the drawing throughout the process. So don't feel like you have to be tied to the graphite sketch you have in place. Understand that you're more than likely going to make changes to the drawing as you continue to apply the media. Now here on the R, if you look closely, you can see a little bit more of that variety and value, and you can get some hints of where some of those subtle little highlights are going to develop just because of the placement of some of the darker values. Now, of course, there is a UPC code here on the side of the wrapper. So we're going to, again, use the ultramarine here first just to draw these lines down. Now, with this marker, it's a little bit difficult to create the variety and line width that you need to have here. As you can see, some of the lines are very similar to each other. In retrospect, I wish I could have captured a little bit more variety in these lines, but they still work and they still translate as a UPC code. Now, of course, this is on the side of the wrapper, and the area around the actual lines is not white. So we're going to add a little bit of 20% warm gray here. And as we go throughout the process, you'll notice that we adjust some of the so-called white areas, which most of them will end up being a little bit more gray. And that's because we have highlights, really strong highlights that are happening in some of these areas. And in order to see some of these highlights, we need to have some contrast and value. So these areas might appear white on the surface, but they're actually a light gray. All right, now it's time to address those red areas, and we're going to start here with a bit of poppy red. And you can see the poppy red leans a little bit more towards orange. It's almost a red-orange, as you can see here. But just like we did with the blue writing and the dark brown sections, we're going to add a little bit more variety in these red sections as well. So right over the top of this initial application with the poppy red, we're going to add a bit of crimson red. You can see it's a little bit more true to a primary red, but it's also slightly darker in value. So that will give us a little bit of variety here and give us the opportunity to create some shadowed areas and some indications of some subtle highlights as well. Now, obviously, at this early stage, it might be hard to envision, but eventually these subtle changes in value will create the illusion that we have a slightly wrinkled wrapper around the candy bar. Now, of course, we shouldn't neglect the smaller logo on the side of the wrapper, and this is a little bit tricky, especially with these markers. Even though I'm using the fine tip, it's still a little bulky in this area. You can see that with my graphite sketch, I basically just wrote out the letters, and then by adding the marker over the top, that gives it the bulkiness that it needs there. Obviously, the same colors that we used on the top portion of the wrapper are used here as well. Now, it's time to address some of the other so-called white areas, and the first area we'll tackle here is where the wrapper kind of folds backwards, and we'll start with a bit of 20% warm gray. We'll also move down to the little bit of wrapper where we can see some of the brown and some of the white writing, and again, we're going to apply the 20% warm gray here as well. Now we'll come back to those areas, but for now we'll go ahead and turn our attention to the chocolate part, the best part, right? And you can see here I'm starting with a color that's a little bit more of a golden brown here. We want to make sure that the chocolate looks different from the wrapper. So we're going to use some slightly different colors here to make sure that we create that contrast. So the first color we're applying here is light tan, and just as we did with the other areas, once we've got our initial application in place, we'll start adding a bit more variety, again paying attention to the shapes of different colors and values that we observe. This color, of course, is followed by a bit of the sienna brown, and of course we use that to add a bit of color to portions of the wrapper as well. But you can see how different this color looks when it's applied over the top of the light tan, which is slightly different. Next, we'll start creating some of the shapes of shadow or the shapes of darker value. Again, we're using dark brown for this. This is the same color that we started with on the wrapper. So 2 of the 3 colors we've used so far are the same colors that we used on the wrapper, but you can see just because of the layering order, how different they look from the colors on the wrapper. We'll also start to indicate some of the cracks and some of the details and things that happen here in the chocolate. Of course, we're going to refine these areas when we apply the colored pencils. We can continue to darken up the shadows here gradually. As I mentioned before, when you apply additional layers of marker over the top of what you've already got in place, it intensifies the color, but it also darkens the value as well. Now our values here aren't quite dark enough, so we'll switch over to the dark umber to make some of those shadows a little bit stronger. Of course, this increases the contrast. It makes the lighter values appear even lighter. And again, this is a color that we've used on the wrapper as well. But again, the layering order makes a huge difference in how that color is perceived. Now, of course, we need to address the area of sugary goodness in between the chocolate, and we're going to start here with a bit of goldenrod, leaving some open areas for some of the stronger highlights. Now, if you cover up some of these highlights, it's not that big of a deal. At the end of the process, we're going to use a bit of gouache to make some of those stronger highlights stand out, but for now we're still going to try to avoid some of those areas and leave some of the white of the paper showing through. Then of course we need to start creating a little bit of contrast here as well, so a bit of dark brown is added. Now we need to add a pop of color in this section as well, just as we've done in the other sections. So a bit of Spanish orange follows. Now this color is used sparingly. And then, of course, on the wrapper itself, we have basically a photo of the sugary goodness inside of the Snickers bar. So we're going to draw these areas just as we would the actual part of the candy bar as well. So again, we're using the same colors here, a bit of goldenrod initially, a bit of the Spanish orange, some of the dark brown here. You can see I've also used a little bit of the light tan. Now for the area that's a little bit lighter in there, I used a different marker here. Now this color is light peach, and that might seem like a strange decision, but as this portion of the drawing develops, you'll see that it makes sense. Now, of course, we need to continue with some of the dark brown and also the light tan as we continue to basically build up a variety of colors and tones in this area. Now a bit more of the dark brown. Just remember that this is an underpainting, and this area will be finely developed, of course, when we apply the colored pencils. So just keep that in mind and try not to overwork this area if you're working alongside of me. Now, of course, we'll repeat this process on the part of the wrapper on the top part of the picture plane. Here you can see I'm adding a bit of that Spanish orange as well to create some of that caramel. And then, of course, just as we did before, we'll add additional contrast and make some of the values a little bit darker with dark brown. Remember, even though we're trying to create a representational image, you don't have to follow the reference exactly. You want to get an idea of the texture, an idea of how that texture is created in your drawing, and then try to replicate that as best as possible. So, in other words, you don't have to copy the image mark for mark. You're just trying to get an approximation of what you're seeing, and then put that approximate information in the right location on your drawing paper. You can see here that I'm going back now and increasing the contrast and making some of the shadows a little bit stronger. This is with dark umber. And of course, as we push the range of value, creating some of those darker tones, it creates additional contrast, and it also helps to push the illusion of texture and the illusion of form. We'll continue with this dark umber, of course, making some of the shadows on the brown part of the label a little bit darker. You'll notice that I'm making sure that I match up the shadowed areas with each individual section of the wrapper. So in other words, where we have an area of shadow on the red part of the label, this carries over into the dark brown section of the wrapper as well, so it makes sense. All right, now we need to make sure that our candy bar is not floating there in a sea of white, so we're going to add a little bit of shadow underneath. And to do this, we'll start with a bit of 20% warm gray. You can see in my initial sketch, went ahead and planned out the shape of the shadow there. But once we have our marker applications in place, of course, you can go in with a kneaded eraser and erase any graphite lines that remain. Now, we need to make the shadow a little bit stronger here, so you can see I'm adding touches of 50% warm gray. Now, of course, since our label is torn, it's actually resting close to the table that the candy bar is resting on. And this is creating an area of stronger shadow just to the right of it. So we'll continue with this 50% warm gray here, filling in this shape for the shadow. Now, of course, if you're wondering what I mean by 50% and 20% warm gray here, the percentages that Prismacolor assigns to these markers basically is a reflection of the intensity of the color. So the higher the percentage, the more intense the gray is. Obviously, the 20% warm gray is a lighter gray, and the 50% warm gray is a darker gray. Now we'll go back to the so-called white parts of the label, and of course I'm putting that in quotations because they're really not white. They're really different varieties of gray, and you can see here I'm going back here with the 20% warm gray, just adding a little bit more variety. We can also go back to the candy part and increase the contrast a little bit further here, this time with a bit of dark umber. So you can see here I'm approaching some of the latter stages of the marker process here as I'm refining our marker underpainting. And now that our marker underpainting is complete, we're ready to start refining the details and refining the drawing, of course, with colored pencil applications. So let's go ahead and dive right into that part of the process. The first color we'll reach for is suitably called chocolate. Now, this is going to act as somewhat of our middle value here. And of course, we're going to push the darker values and lighter values and also add pops of color as we go through the process, just like we did with the marker applications. So here in this initial stage, I'm trying to figure out which pencils I really want to use. Obviously, the chocolate is a good choice, but then we need to add pops of color as well. So a bit of burnt ochre is used for this, and then of course for some of the highlights, we'll use a bit of white. Now, it's important to note that we really want to use white once we've got a little bit of colored pencil on the surface so that it blends and mixes to a certain degree. When we put it right over the top of the marker applications, you'll see a little bit of the graininess of the tooth of the paper showing through. And we really don't want that. We really want it to have a smoother appearance. And if we've got a bit of colored pencil material on the surface, we will create that smoother appearance. Now, obviously, I'm starting to darken up the values here, creating some stronger shadows, and for this, I'm using a bit of dark brown. Now, obviously, the dark brown does darken up the values, but we need them to go one step darker. So for this, I'm using walnut brown from the Polychromos line by Faber-Castell. Now, if you don't have Polychromos pencils, of course, you can substitute this color with dark umber from the Prismacolor line. I'm also using these pencils to refine the edges a bit, making the edges a bit sharper. And then, of course, it's just a repetition of what we did in that first section. But you can see here I've switched over now to a lighter blue. This is powder blue, and I'm using this to create the highlights in areas. White can sometimes look a little bit unnatural, and sometimes we can see hints of color in the highlights on the objects that we observe. And in this case, it appears to me like some of the highlights are a little bit cooler, and that's why I'm choosing to use this lighter blue to develop some of the highlights. And then, of course, we'll continue to alternate colors as we see fit. Here, a bit more of the burnt ochre. And then as we push the range of value, this time with a bit of the walnut brown, we start to understand the wrinkles and recesses that we see on the end of the wrapper here. Now, some of the dark areas aren't quite dark enough, and we need to make the shadows appear a little bit more realistic. Now, to do this, I'm using a bit of indigo blue. This, of course, might seem like a strange decision, but when you mix a dark brown and a dark blue, it creates a more natural-looking black. This is preferred over using a black colored pencil. Black can sometimes make an area appear flat and unnatural, and our shadows, just like our highlights, usually have a bit of color associated with them. So that indigo blue creates a little bit of a cooler shadow, which, of course, looks a little bit more natural. We'll continue working down the label, of course, using the same combination of colors. And I've found with a colored pencil drawing, you typically discover a formula, a combination of colors that you tend to use throughout the piece, and that's what we're doing here. We've discovered our formula, so to speak, and we'll just repeat this formula throughout all of the dark brown areas on the wrapper. There is a bit of reflected highlight, as you can see here. I'm addressing with the powder blue. A reflected highlight, of course, is light that's reflected off of the surface back onto another surface, and our surface is white, so a bit of that light is reflected back on the underside, just above the area of cast shadow. Now, of course, we have light that is hitting the top of the candy bar wrapper as well, so we'll need to create a more natural-looking highlight up here as well, again with the powder blue. Now you can see I'm using a colorless blender here. Now, a colorless blender is just the colored pencil material void of any color. Now you might be wondering, what's the advantage of using a colorless blender? Well, a colorless blender basically applies more wax to the surface, or in this case, a bit more wax, and it causes the colored pencils on the surface to mix together a little bit. And the result is it eradicates some of the tooth or texture produced by the paper, creating a smoother appearance. A lot of times, colored pencil artists refer to this process as burnishing. All right, now we're moving on to the top part of the picture plane here. We've got a little bit of that torn wrapper. And again, the process is the same. We're using the same combination of colors, maybe not in the same order, but the process here is basically designed to create more contrast, more of a range of value, and of course to make the applications appear more solid and also to refine the edges. Now you can see I'm using a bit of 20% French gray over the top of some of the areas where we can see the inside part of the candy bar. Of course, this is a photograph on the wrapper itself, after which we'll go back in with some of the burnt ochre here. Again, we're just going to build up our colored pencil applications, making this area appear a little bit more like it's painted. In fact, a lot of people refer to a colored pencil drawing as a colored pencil painting because it is somewhat similar to using an opaque painting medium. Now, again, back to the walnut brown. Again, I'll remind you, if you don't have this color, but you do have the Prismacolor pencils, you can substitute this with dark umber. Now, of course, it may seem obvious, but I'm continuing to look at the reference. So we've drawn the subject once initially, and we've drawn it again with markers, and now we're drawing it again with colored pencils. So as we continue to apply layers of the different mediums to the surface, we're continually drawing this subject. And as we do so, we become more and more familiar with it, and our drawing becomes more and more representational as we go through the process. Keep in mind that although we're making marks when we're creating a drawing or even a painting, drawing and painting is about observation. So we should be spending a good amount of time observing our subject. In fact, I like to think of drawing as at least 50% observation. And what that means is you should be spending half the time it takes to create a piece of art actually studying and looking at your subject. This means that you should be continually looking and studying your subject. Even though my pencil is continuing to move here, my eyes are going back and forth between the subject and also the drawing surface. So I'm picking up information from the reference and then just taking that information and trying to place it as accurately as possible within the drawing. As you can see here, we've moved on to the lower portion of the picture plane where we have the torn wrapper. And again, the process remains the same colors. Now, let's move on to the part that's photographed at the lower part of the picture plane here, and we'll start developing some of the colors here. We'll start in that lighter area with a bit of sable, and you can see how these colors are kind of combining to create more of a natural appearance. You can also see that I used a little bit more of a scribbling technique here to fill in that area, and then over the top we'll apply a bit of the 20% French gray. You can see here as we continue to layer colored pencil applications over the top of the marker applications, some of the marker applications obviously show through, which is what we want. This, of course, is resulting in more depth in the color. And a lot of times we want to create more depth in the color because it ultimately leads to a more representational appearance. More depth in color, or creating depth in color, usually as a result of layering colors. And that's why layering colors is so important in any colored pencil drawing. We'll add a few indications of some subtle highlights here with a bit of white, and we'll also use that white in some of the areas of that lighter section as well, just to create a little bit more variety. Now we'll return to our chocolate color here. This is, of course, a darker brown, and we'll start creating some of the darker values that we see in here. Of course, the contrast between the darker and lighter values is going to lead to the illusion of the texture here. Now, of course, we'll use a bit of the colorless blender here to smooth out the applications, working the material into the tooth or texture of the paper. Now, of course, this is a wrapper, so there is a little bit of a highlight happening here. A bit of the powder blue here works to create a subtle highlight. Then we'll move on to the next section of the wrapper, of course, following the same procedure, using the same colors here. A bit of chocolate, a bit of white, just a touch of the burnt ochre is used here and there to develop this particular section. You'll also notice that I'm refining the lettering here with a bit of white. And then of course we can make some of the sections a little bit darker with the walnut brown. Again, if you don't have walnut brown with the, these are polychromos pencils, you can substitute with the dark umber from the Prismacolor line. And then of course a subtle highlight exists here as well. So again, with the powdered blue. Then, as we have throughout the process, we can make the shadows even darker with a bit of indigo blue. Alright, now it's back to the main portion of the label, and we're just about ready to address the red sections. But before we do, let's go ahead and define the lettering here in these red sections, with a white pencil, obviously. Then we can start addressing some of the red sections. We'll start here with a bit of Scarlet Lake. We'll continue with the Scarlet Lake, of course, covering up the majority of the red sections, putting lighter pressure in the areas where the highlights are located. Then we need to add a little bit more of an orange feel to this particular part of the label. So a bit of poppy red is used for that, and then we'll start pushing the highlights here with a bit of white. Now, if you make your highlight a little bit too strong, as I did here, we can go right over the top of it with another pencil, in this case a bit of the poppy red, to tone down that highlight to a certain degree. So we do have control over the strength of the highlights and shadows to a certain degree. It's not going to work totally like an opaque painting medium where it can cover things up completely, but we can affect the values, pushing them a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Now we'll create a little hint of shadow here. We'll use a bit of Crimson Red, which is just slightly darker than the reds that we've used previously. Now, of course, that color wasn't quite dark enough, so we'll use a little bit of dark brown here to make the shadow a little bit darker. Now, obviously, we're using brown here to make the shadow a little bit darker because red is a warm color. If it was a cool color, we might consider using indigo blue to make the shadow a little bit darker. Now, before we start adding some blue colored pencil applications to the label, we'll first define the little light areas, the white areas in the lettering here with a white pencil. And we'll also go ahead and put some indications of some of the subtle highlights that happen on the top of the wrapper. I'm using a light to medium application here, and I'm moving the pencil around in a circular motion because eventually we want these highlights to basically be blended out, and that's why we're adding them first. What I mean by blended out is we want a smooth gradation from the darker blue to the lighter blue. All right, now we're ready to start adding a bit of blue here to the writing here. We're going to start with ultramarine, which is the same color that we used with the markers. You can see I'm slightly overlapping some of those whiter highlights, and we'll smooth those out in just a moment with the colorless blender. Of course, we'll need to address the lines for the UPC code. First, we'll start with a bit of white, basically just enhancing the shapes of the blue lines here by basically drawing in the negative sections. We'll also add a bit of shadow here where the wrapper kind of crinkles here at the corner. And to do so, we'll use a little bit of 20% warm gray. We'll go ahead and carry this warm gray down into the so-called white section of the UPC label because, remember, we're dealing with a slightly darker value here. It's not exactly white. And then we'll enhance some of the darker values that we see here in this little crinkled section with a bit of 70% warm gray. Using this 70% warm gray, we'll go ahead and enhance the strong cast shadow right underneath the candy bar. And again, this additional contrast just enhances the illusion that the candy bar is actually sitting on the surface and not floating there in space. Now we need to enhance the blue writing a little bit before we do any of the blending. And to do this, we'll use a slightly darker blue. This is blue violet. So we're still going to leave some areas where there's a little bit of variety in the value. So we'll have slightly darker areas of blue, slightly lighter areas of blue, and some middle values of blue in the writing as well. Even though these are subtle transitions, they're going to make a big difference in creating a realistic illusion in our final drawing. And then, of course, once we've got those blue applications in place, we'll use the colorless blender to smooth the transitions between the different values. Now, of course, we need to enhance some of the grays in the white section of the label. So we'll start here with a bit of the 20% warm gray. Again, putting fairly heavy pressure on the pencil so that we get a fairly intense application here. We're, of course, leaving open areas, though, where we know we're going to have some strong highlights. When we have a reflective surface like we do with this label, we're going to have areas of strong highlight, of course. Now, in an area where we have white on the label, we need to make sure that we create some contrast so that our strong highlights pop, of course. And that's why we're covering the bulk of this section with the 20% warm gray. Of course, we're leaving the areas open where we know we're going to have those strong highlights. Now, we also want a smooth appearance to these sections, so we'll use the colorless blender to work the material into the tooth of the paper. Then we do have a few little indications of some shadows, especially at this crinkled part at the end. So a bit of the 70% warm gray is used here. Then, of course, we can do a little bit of burnishing and a little bit of toning down of that 70% warm gray with a bit of 20% warm gray. We'll continue down to the label or the logo on the bottom part of the wrapper here. This is a bit of 30% warm gray, just making that area appear a little bit more natural because it is somewhat in shadow. Now we'll move on to that section where the wrapper is peeled back, and in this particular white section, we do see some of the colors on the other side shining through or showing through the white side. So we'll start here with a bit of ultramarine using a very light touch here, just defining the shapes that we see in the reference. We'll also use a bit of poppy red to indicate the red sections. You can see I'm using a very, very light touch here. Now, of course, we need to enhance some of the grays here. We'll start with a bit of 20% warm gray. And I'm applying the color with a moderate to heavy pressure. We'll also go over the top of our red and blue applications using this color as well. This acts to burnish the color a little bit. It mutes it as well. Then we'll go slightly darker with our grays with a bit of 30% warm gray. And then of course we'll use the colorless blender to burnish these applications. And you can see here, although we started with a fairly grainy appearance, once we go over the top of these applications with the colorless blender, a lot of that graininess is eradicated. Again, this is part of the wrapper, so there is some subtle highlight here and there. We'll use a bit of white to address these subtle highlights. And then it's back to the 30% warm gray here. This is just a bit of 20% warm gray, again, addressing some of the remaining sections. And it's really amazing how much variety of different values you can find in even a section that is considered white. So we're just paying close attention to the reference and where we're seeing some slight changes in value. We can, of course, adjust these slight changes. Just a moment ago, I was using 30% warm gray, and now I've switched over to the 70% warm gray. And I'm just touching a few areas to create some strong contrast. Now we'll go ahead and make the shadow where this part of the label touches the chocolate a little bit stronger with the 70% warm gray. And then, of course, we'll burnish the remaining areas in this section, making sure that we've smoothed out all the applications and as much of the texture of the paper is taken care of. We're still going to see it to a certain degree, especially in these light areas, but with the colorless blender, we can eradicate much of that toothiness, or that texture produced by the toothiness, I should say. Then, of course, we'll move down to the bottom section here where we've got basically the same process. You can see I've added a little bit of that 20% warm gray, now a bit of the poppy red, and then, of course, a touch of the ultramarine. Again, using a very light touch in the early stages. Now we do see a little bit of brown popping through in this particular section, so we'll use a bit of the chocolate to address those sections. And then again, we'll continue to burnish and layer with a bit of 20% warm gray. Here I'm intensifying some of the dark brown sections with a bit of the 70% warm gray. Now we're ready to address the most delicious part of this drawing. Of course, that is the chocolate. And we're going to start here with a slightly lighter and warmer brown. This color is light umber, and you can see I'm applying it with a light application, allowing some of those reddish browns that we applied with the marker to show through. Now, just as we have throughout the drawing, we'll start enhancing the colors a bit. Here we're using a bit of the burnt ochre. Of course, we've used this color on the label as well. And we're applying it right over the top of the light umber, and you can see that these colors are mixing to a certain degree. I'm also putting a fairly heavy amount of pressure on the pencil to build up some wax on the surface so that our burnishing and our blending happens a little bit easier. Now a little bit of the 20% French gray to create some of the stronger highlights. And as we push the values in this section, you'll notice that the candy bar starts to appear a little bit more three-dimensional. Of course, the majority of the raised sections do have these little highlights or lighter areas, but it's interesting to find that some of the recessed areas are also picking up a bit of light as well. We'll continue adding some of the highlights with this same color. And since we have actually two light sources in this scene, we have a light coming from the left and a light coming from the right, we do have highlights on either side of the candy bar. Now we'll begin burnishing some of these colors together with a bit of the colorless blender, and as you can see, I'm applying very heavy pressure to the surface to do so. We'll also start enhancing some of the darker values. Appropriately, we'll use the color chocolate to start this process. As you can see, I'm going right along some of the ridges that are created right next to some of those highlights to make those highlights a little bit stronger, and of course make those ridges appear a little bit more pronounced. Now, there is a little bit of a reflected highlight, just like we saw on the label down on the lower portion of the candy bar. So just a touch of the 20% French gray is used here. And then as we have throughout the process, of course, we'll continue to push the range of value, increasing the contrast, this time with a bit of the walnut brown. Again, this is the pencil that I'm using from the Polychromos line. Again, you can substitute this with dark umber from the Prismacolor line. We'll also use this dark color, of course, to accentuate some of the cracks and even add some of the cracks that we didn't include with the marker underpainting. You'll notice that we often see, or in this case, we see dark values right next to light values. And of course, getting those in the right position is going to go a long way in creating the illusion of realism that we're after in this drawing. Of course, there are some smaller recesses and little textures and things that happen even in this milk chocolate goodness. So, of course, we can accentuate those, of course, with this walnut pencil as well. As we see areas that need a little bit more color, a little bit more depth in color, we can address those areas here. The lower corner needs a little bit more color here. So we'll use a little bit of chocolate, and then of course we'll use the colorless blender to work this into the surface, creating a more painted, more natural appearance. We'll also use the 20% French gray, in this case, to create some highlights, even in the area of shadow, and that's because the candy bar is cracked here and it's picking up a few indications of light. And around those little recesses, those interesting recesses that happen there, we'll add a few highlights as well. And then, of course, it's back to the indigo blue to make our shadows appear a little bit more natural and make them a little bit stronger and richer as well. Now, of course, we're using the indigo blue a little bit sparingly in these sections. If you find that these applications make your shadows too blue, you can always go back over the top of them with a darker brown and tone them down. All right, now there is just a touch of caramel showing through the chocolate here. So we'll address this with a little bit more of a yellow color. This is sand, and it's just going to give us a color that's very similar to what's observed in the reference. We see a little bit of this down here at the corner as well, so we'll carry some of this color in this location as well. And then we'll add a few more highlights here. We'll carry some of these highlights down into the middle part of the candy bar as well. We're starting with the highlights in this section because it's a little bit harder to make an area lighter if we accidentally make it too dark. So sometimes it's a good idea to start with some of the lighter values before moving over to some of the darker values. Now we need a pop of color down here. So we're going to use a little bit of canary yellow, and this is a strong yellow. It's very close to being a primary yellow. So we're going to use a delicate touch here, and we're going to use it a little bit sparingly. So we're not going to use it everywhere in this section, just a couple of pops of color here and there so that we have a little bit more variety. Now we'll add a bit of the burnt ochre here to give us more of those oranges that we observe, and then back to the chocolate to create some of those darker values. And of course, since we're using a pencil here, we have a lot more control compared to what we had with the marker. So we can get a little bit more detailed in this section. Remember, you're creating an illusion, so you want to, of course, observe your reference and take information from that reference, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same as what you see in the reference. I know I've mentioned this before, but I think it bears repeating. A lot of times people get wrapped up in all those details and feel like they have to replicate them exactly, and they don't. You just need to have a similar texture to what you're observing in the reference in order to create a convincing illusion. All right, now we're ready to start adding colored pencil applications to our shadows. Now, we're not going to cover all of the shadow locations with colored pencil applications. We're just going to mainly focus on the areas that are close to where the candy bar actually hits the surface. So we're going to start here with a bit of 30% warm gray, just enhancing some of the shadowed areas. Basically, what we're doing here is in the areas where the marker applications are fairly dark in value, we're going over the top of them with the colored pencil application so they appear a little bit more solid. And this can be a little bit tricky when we have a gradation of value like we do on the right side of the picture plane. So you can see I'm starting with heavier pressure closer to the candy bar and then allowing that pressure to be lessened as we move away. This will create a gradation of value in this particular section, which is really how shadows behave. There's typically a slow change or sometimes a fast change between dark values and light values. In this particular case, we have a slow change from a slightly darker value to a slightly lighter value in the core area of the shadow. And that's why we're putting less pressure as we work our way away from the candy bar. But before we do any burnishing or smoothing out of these applications, we'll go ahead and enhance the shadow that's the strongest right down here at the lower right-hand portion of the candy bar. This with a little bit of 70% warm gray. And then, of course, we can soften these applications, mute them to a certain degree. And to do this, we're using a little bit of 20% warm gray to do so. Of course, this is burnishing some of those applications. It's also lightening the value to a certain degree. Now it's time to switch over to the colorless blender, and this is where we're going to put heavy pressure on the pencil to create more of a solid appearance and also a smoother gradation between those slightly lighter values and slightly darker values. And in this particular case, because we have those marker applications underneath, it's a little bit easier to create that transition because the marker applications do such a wonderful job of creating a natural shadow on their own. Now our colored pencil applications are complete, but the drawing is not complete. We're now ready to add a little bit of highlight magic, I like to call it. And to do so, we're going to use a medium called gouache. Gouache is opaque watercolor, and it can be applied directly over the top of colored pencil applications. And for this, I'm just going to be using a bit of white. And I'm not using a whole lot of water in the mix because I want these highlights to be very strong. You can see I'm using a very small round brush to apply the gouache to the surface. So in this case, I'm just looking for the areas where the highlights are super strong, and I'm adding these highlights here and there. And the addition of these highlights is really going to pull everything together. It's going to make this image all of a sudden appear very realistic. These highlights, of course, are incredibly important, and if you try to apply these with colored pencil on their own, they're not going to be quite strong enough to create the illusion that we're after, and that's why, of course, I'm using gouache to do so. Now, I should point out that these highlights work best on reflective surfaces like the shiny wrapper. We might see a couple of indications of highlights on the actual chocolate part. We're definitely going to see a few of these in the inside part of the candy bar where we have a wet surface. And whenever we have a wet surface, of course, we're going to have some strong reflected light in those locations as well. So mainly we're going to apply these highlights on the wrapper and just a few touches inside of the candy bar. You can see here as we're adding these highlights on the inside of the candy bar, this area is starting to look like it's wet and it's starting to look more realistic. For me, anyway, this is the most rewarding part of a process like this, adding these strong highlights, because it really is a little bit magical, and that's why I dub it Highlight Magic. And now our colored pencil and marker drawing of a candy bar is complete. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. I'll remind you, if you're new to the channel or if you haven't done so yet, why not subscribe? We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter here. Make sure you click on that notification bell so you're notified when we upload a new video. If you want to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. There's a link in the description below. And if you want to check out our fantastic membership program, which includes a variety of drawing and painting courses, a variety of drawing and painting media as well, and weekly live lessons, which are all recorded and stored in our vault of recorded live lessons, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. There's a link to check out our program in the description below. Everyone starts out for a week-long trial for free, so you can check out the program for a week for free and see if it's right for you. Thanks again so much for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.